Okay, let's first recognize Channel Awesome's contribution, who pointed out years ago the connections Sleepy Hollow has with the Hammer horror films. You can see this right from the first image, with the hot red wax having the saturated, viscous sheen of Hammer movie blood from the 1950s and 60s. Very cool stuff. And if you want to know how the movie varies from the original Washington Irving story, Brian Hollinger goes through some of that. Or just watch the Disney version. Or the version with Jeff Goldblum if you need your Ichabod as a lanky schoolmaster. These are equally unfaithful to the original story, but more classic, I guess. Burton's Sleepy Hollow is not super interested in telling a gothic tale. It has the visual trappings of that genre, but it does something quite peculiar with it. On top of Irving's story and the Hammer horror visual style I just talked about, it overlays the tropes of a detective story. The detective story, which most people credit Edgar Allan Poe as the inventor of, in stories such as The Purloined Letter, is a genre that parallels, and one could argue is made possible by, the development of modernity. Modernity is a tricky word to pin down, but we can define it in opposition to the medieval, feudal, pastoral times before the industrial age and capitalistic modes of production. And it is precisely this tension between the modern and the pre-modern that Andrew Kevin Walker, the screenwriter, dramatizes by combining a period Gothic horror story and a detective mystery together. Naming that tension also gets us closer to the subtext of the movie. Walker, prior to writing Sleepy Hollow, had made his name writing the movie Seven, and that movie is engaged in exactly the same mishmash of time periods, but inverted. What do I mean? That story is set in a modern, nameless city in which two police detectives are hunting a serial killer carrying out ritualized murders that correspond to the 7 deadly sins. These sins:
gluttony, greed, sloth, wrath, pride, lust, and envy,
are from a pre-modern age in which the Catholic Church dominated all forms of social and cultural life. John Doe's project, therefore, is atavistic in nature. He wants to expose modernity to its own pathological indifference to sin.
We see a deadly sin on every street corner, in every home, and we tolerate it. We tolerate it because it's common. It's trivial. We tolerate it morning, noon, and night.
To even call them sins, quote unquote, in a modern context, calls attention to John Doe's archaic obsessions. We now label them narcissistic personality disorder, depression, obesity, sex addiction, and the like. So in constructing another modern, pre-modern antagonism in Sleepy Hollow, it seems that one of Walker's guiding lights is to dramatize the lack of ethical development, you could say, in European Western societies. To put it another way, both movies spotlight the many ways we remain much closer to our barbarous ancestors than what anodyne modern discourse can admit to or allow. The ending of the film is thus duplicitous. Johnny Depp's Ichabod Crane proudly announces the modern age.
Just in time for a new century.
As if the horrors of Sleepy Hollow will simply be stories of the old ways, gathering dust on bookshelves. But of course, us moderns are aware that this is really not the case. When Ichabod exclaims,
"You are bewitched by reason."
I am beaten down by it.
It reaches out and grabs the modern man and woman who is even more beaten down by reason. For one cannot in fact reason his or her way through the appalling arc of humanity in the 19th and 20th century. By using terms such as morality, ethics, reason, and the like, I'm analyzing the film using the terms of idealism, one of the tentpoles of philosophy. But the other tentpole, materialism, is also there. Because the movie over and over again brings up the conflict between people living at the same time but under very different economic circumstances. The film can be read two different ways. As a pessimistic meditation on the corruptibility of the human spirit, a kind of metaphysical reading, or as a historical account of the roots of wretched human behavior, as conditioned by the hardships of class conflict. The two viewpoints come together at the climax. The horseman carries Mary back to hell. Thus, evil has finally been vanquished. That's the idealistic reading. And also, the world of the medieval peasant that Mary represents has been carried away to make room for the emerging bourgeoisie and modernity. That's the materialistic reading. Lady Mary, to my mind, is more a product of her environment, and not just pure evil. She was born to poor parents who were land tenants, not quite serfs, and in some ways worse. And when her father died, they were uprooted from their home. Mother and daughters then lived as outcasts in the woods because of accusations of witchcraft. This is Puritan New England, after all. And Mary and her sister later, in fact, became masters of the dark arts. Mary commits her soul to Satan.
Hail Satan!
Yes. To avenge the plight of her parents at the hands of the wealthy Van Gerrits and Van Tassels, and thus joins forces with the professional soldier to kill both the town aristocrats and civil servants. She also commands the horsemen to kill ordinary workers, like the servant girl and the midwife. And the midwife's child, which is the most unsettling part of the movie. So the class conflict is, shall we say, very messy. Mary is a social climber of the most venal sort, to be sure, but animated by very real class politics. She was literally consigned by the community to starvation. And her only way to overcome her class position is to renounce by omission her low-class origins and scheme her way into the marriage bed.
Her body into the grave, and my own into the marriage bed.
Yes, that's what I said. Of the higher social class. Mary does all of this because she wants the brass ring of the new age, defining feature of Enlightenment humanity. Property.
It's free real estate.
If you want to boil it all down, Sleepy Hollow is a story about the struggle over property rights and inheritance. Mary's fundamental problem is that what she's after, property and wealth made possible through modern legal systems, is at odds with her self-definition to a way of life and an age facing extinction. Her witch stuff, her witchiness. What's the word? Sorcery? Her vendetta is doomed, not so much by the hobbyist sleuthing of the inept, fatuous Ichabod, but by what he symbolizes, the rapid emergence of a new age, and with it the onrush of capitalistic industrialization and the growth of cities.
Just in time for a new century.
And with that point, we must now talk about two other themes that in a way join hands with one another. The first, which is I think fairly obvious to anyone who watches the movie, is the clash between urban and rural. Ichabod embodies the ways of the city. His entrance into the rural is for all intents a journey back into the past, to a time of superstitions, miracles, magic.
We have murders in New York without benefit of ghouls and goblins.
You're a long way from New York, Constable.
Is also the man.
You don't know because you were not there.
Mary and her ill-fated magical sister are women of the forest, like sprites or something. Or the witch in Hansel and Gretel. Point being, if it has to do with supernatural forces in nature, most likely a woman will be representing that theme. Male is therefore urban, i.e. modern and rational, and woman is rural, i.e. pre-modern and irrational. The person who straddles these two worlds is Katrina, Mary's stepdaughter. She is also a practitioner of magic, but it is an innocuous kind, like a pastime, something very close to astrology maybe. Her brand of magic never seems to work, except by pure happenstance. That moment in itself drives home a lot of what I've been saying. It is not magic that saves Ichabod, but a book, the primary symbol of rationality and reason. But back to Katrina. What does work for her, in the end, is being the final heir to the Van Tassel fortune, and upon Mary's demise, she is able to climb out of the dark historical realms of the pre-modern, neatly represented by Sleepy Hollow and its forests, and into the brightly lit world of the modern era. Burton and his cinematographer, Emmanuel Lubezki, yes, that Lubezki, the most acclaimed DP of the last 30 years, punctuate the change in location and mood through an abrupt alteration in lighting and color. And even though that's an important visual cue, the emergence of Katrina from one age into another can only be finalized by her fusion with Ichabod, most likely through eventual marriage. Thus a change of her surname away from the old world of the Van Tassels and the new modernity of the Cranes. The final shot is of Ichabod leading her by the hand from the carriage to be swallowed by the enormity of the city. The woman, the rural, is absorbed into the male, the urban. I could tie other threads into this argument. For example, Ichabod's flashbacks during sickness to his own witch mother, a child of nature, as he calls her.
Child of nature.
Yes, that's what I said. Who's put to death in a medieval torture device by his Christian zealot father. The event leaves Ichabod marked with a kind of stigmata on his hands, which bleed in a supernatural fashion at one point. This mark of the superstitious feminine informs his temperament as a vain, weak, cowardly man.
It was a headless horseman.
What happened?
In this
We're
way,
leaving
the
now.
movie can also be read as a conquering of the female frailties inside of the modern man. That in order for modernity to fully emerge in a stereotypical masculine sense, I guess you could say, we could be vulgar and say become fully erect.
Yeah, baby.
The wily ways of the female, who in biblical lore spoke to the snake in the garden, must be abolished or else fully integrated and nullified. We can imagine two epilogues to this story. One, that Katrina will continue her harmless avocation by taking up tarot cards and seances or some such. And that upon Ichabod's return to the force, he will lead a crusade of police reform. The feminine is thus contained and the masculine is ascendant. Of course, the contradiction here is that Ichabod's push for modern reforms will result in institutions and bureaucracies that our modern culture characterizes over and over again as weak and ineffectual. In other words, feminine. Yeah, feminine.
Is that what a man looks like?
Us moderns continually wring our hands about the, quote, crisis of masculinity in an effeminizing society. What Ichabod represents is a boogeyman for that kind of discourse. As with all movies set not in their own time but some other, Sleepy Hollow is saying something more about the end of the millennium than the end of the 18th century. The movie combines thematic tensions of pre-modern and modern, rural, urban, feminine, masculine, along with the imposition of the detective procedural, which was in vogue at the time, that suggests to me an underlying sense of unease in the culture. It was a time of prosperity, the end of the Cold War, triumph of liberal capitalism. And yet with this movie, and so many others produced right at the end of the millennium, a sense of apprehension prevailed. This movie is trying to detect, as it were, the precise moment that humanity, or at least the American piece of it, made its wrong turn, just as it was deluding itself, like Ichabod, that the future was going to be just peachy. I think Sleepy Hollow, in a weird way, is kind of a prequel to Seven. The two movies are kind of peering at one another through either end of a very long tunnel. John Doe wants to do away with Ichabod's civilizing half-measures and equivocations. He views the horsemen and Mary as evil souls, period, and is full of righteous fury that their kind are now just roaming free.
There is but one path. We kill them all.
These sort of sentiments are not rational attitudes, attempting to justify conclusions through logic. They are romantic notions. The romance imbued in the character of John Doe, and Tyler Durden, for that matter, is the same kind the great poets of the 18th and 19th century spoke about. They were infatuated with a mythical, organic past, the same past that Ichabod in a sense defeats and then turns his back on. But that longing for the primeval, the mythical, didn't just disappear. Those quixotic quests for the pre-modern wholeness of life continued on and reached their apex, well, right here. This is what is lurking in the darkness on the other side of Ichabod's new century.